how tall Goliath was, but I figured it has an impact behind it. Hopefully you can appreciate. We've been talking about the heroes of the Old Testament specifically this month. I've not done a good job, and I want to apologize first and foremost. I've not done a good job this year at giving you my monthly theme before the month actually begins. If you've not known, I publish in the Connect the first half and the second half of the year, my sermon plan, to tell you what I'm talking about each week, and then kind of giving you an idea that there is, believe it or not, a design behind the 52 times I get to talk to you on Sunday mornings and give you 25, 30, 35 minutes maybe of what we're talking about this week and kind of give you some insight into what the Word of God has to say for us that week. And so kind of planning it out, the most I've ever planned it out has been this year. But I've not done a good job at explaining to you at the beginning of the month what the monthly theme is. And so I want to try to do better at explaining to you what the month looks like when it comes to my preaching. And this month it's already over, but it has been the idea of looking at the Hebrew, the Old Testament Bible, the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, looking at heroes from that text and having modern day lessons that we can learn from those people. So just to kind of remind you of where we've been so far this month, we've had the faith of Abraham, so looking at the father of the faithful and seeing the amount of faith that he had to have to be who he was in the book of Genesis. We saw the perseverance of Joseph, that despite circumstances, he was able to trust in God's plan and his will and to persevere through difficulty and to have that kind of that grit to be able to be faithful even in those conditions. We talked about Moses and his ability to lead the people of Israel. He was classically trained for almost 40 years of being a shepherd, dealing with a group of dumb animals and leading them away from danger into a place of safety, prepared him perfectly to deal with the people of God for almost 40 years and dealing with a bunch of issues, but his leadership ability of trusting in God and waiting on God's timing and so on, we talked about last week. And today we're going to be concluding our month talking about the courage of David. And where else could you go than talking about David and Goliath? Now, I've preached this before about 2 years ago here, and what I did for that sermon was I just preached through the entirety of the text. Essentially just read it to you with some emphasis in certain areas, and the little boy in me got so excited because this is one of those stories that when I first ever heard it, I'd never heard it before. I was a 15-year-old kid, and I was just blown away at the drama and the adventure and the action scene that is David versus Goliath. I mean, the coolest part is just kind of tracking Goliath's sword through the narrative of 1st and 2nd Samuel, seeing where it ends up, when David uses it. To me, that's just the coolest part because, I'm a 15-year-old boy at heart still. But the idea of looking at the courage of David, despite the size and the words of Goliath, is going to be our focus for this morning. So what I want to do is go over to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're just going to look at verses 45 through 50. Now, I'd love to go through the entirety of the text once again. As I've said, every single sermon this month, if we do that, we're going to be here forever. So all these stories are way larger than I can fit into a 25, 30, 35-minute sermon. And so if you don't know this story or aren't familiar with it, if you forget the details, I'd encourage you to go on your own time to read the rest of this entire chapter because there are so many rich details that get brought up that we're not going to be discussing this morning. So we'll look over in 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 45, to kind of set the stage just a little bit for us to begin the conversation about the text. We've got a man named Goliath, and he wasn't just any man. He was a giant. He's a tall guy. And so he is big, and he is a man of war. He is a fearsome warrior, and he's of the nation of the Philistines. You have the Israelites, who currently have a king, and the king's name is Saul. He's the first king of Israel. And they are both on this side of a mountain. One's on one side, one's on the other. And down in the valley in between them is the place where you're going to have one-on-one combat. So instead of having both armies just go and duke it out in the valley, they send a champion. The Philistines send their biggest guy, I would assume, named Goliath, right? He's down in the valley, and he has been yelling at the Israelites who are cowardly and afraid, making fun of Yahweh, God of all people, and saying, you guys are going to lose. So the young shepherd boy David comes to check on his brothers who are in the military, comes to bring them some supplies and provisions, and overhears what Goliath has to say about God. So David, a young shepherd boy, comes over to the Israelites and says, what's your problem? Why aren't you killing this guy? He is belittling our God. And so they go, we're not going to go and fight him. We're going to die. I mean, that makes sense to me. You got a 7-foot, 8-foot dude over here yelling at you to come fight. I don't want to fight either. But David says, is there not a cause? Isn't there a reason to go and show him how powerful our God is? And so word gets back to King Saul, who doesn't want to go out either. And he says, if you want to go fight him, I'll let you go fight him if you want. You know, if you win, then we win the combat and they become our slaves. If you lose, then we're their slaves. So kind of a lot's riding on this, to paraphrase heavily as I do. And he goes, you know what? I'll send you out there, David. So put on my armor and then go out there. He puts the armor on. It's way too big for him. He's not tested it, not tried combat in this armor. Throws the armor off. Doesn't even take a sword. He just goes and gets 5 smooth stones from the riverbank, and he's got his sling. Now, in my 15-year-old brain, the first time I heard that, I'm like, this dude's got a slingshot? I'm like, I've got a slingshot at home and a BB gun and a pellet gun. Like, he's as armored and as weaponized as I was as a 15-year-old kid. Now, of course, it wasn't a slingshot with the rubber and the elastic. It was a sling, a pouch that would hold a rock, and 2 strips of leather coming off of that. And apparently you could hold that, swing it above your head, let one of the ropes go, and then it would shoot that rock forward at a high rate of speed. That's his weapon against a 7, almost 8-foot tall warrior wearing armor with a shield, with a spear, and with a sword. I mean, the odds are not in his favor, right? So he comes out to face down Goliath. And Goliath thinks it's a joke. He makes fun of this little guy who's come forward to fight Goliath of all people. And he says, I've been fighting in wars since I was your age. We pick up our text, 1 Samuel chapter 17, in verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies, we mean, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Whew. Again, 15-year-old Alan is stoked. These are fighting words right here. I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand into his bag and took out a stone and slung it, which is a great way to say it in the English. He slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. Lucky shot, right? No, not at all. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face into the ground. Now, I've shot many a woodland creature with my slingshot, with my BB gun, with my pellet gun. Sorry, Mom. I know how those holes got into your bird feeders. And I finally admit it. I shot your birds, Mom. I'm so sorry. But I have never seen something like a stone sink into something's forehead before. A bird's forehead's quite small, right? But to get past the forehead, there's this thing called a skull. Do you know that? Right behind this skin of your forehead. And to sink into it is a pretty big deal. Y'all say gross? 15-year-old Alan says, that's awesome. Sinks into his head, drops to the ground. Verse 50, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. I stopped right there intentionally because 51 is my favorite verse. 51 simply says he walked over and grabbed the giant's sword and cut his head off with it. I mean, come on. That's an action movie right there. That's like John Wick, but like back in the day, right? This is an action-packed scene. And although, again, 15-year-old Alan thinks this is the coolest story in the world, the lessons from David, a young shepherd boy, standing up to a man of war who is a giant, is a huge lesson for all of us. The idea of the courage this young boy had in the face of an adversary who was a giant warrior is a huge, huge lesson for all of us. Here's a couple of thoughts of what we can pull from this story for our own modern-day application. We have to first recognize that David had courage, and that courage began with a God-centered identity. When King Saul asked him before he sent David out, what makes you think that you can beat Goliath? The answer was, I've been a shepherd boy, protecting my father's flock, and a lion and a bear took some of the sheep away. And I beat the lion and I beat the bear to save my father's sheep. He knew that God gave him the victory over a lion and a bear, which are not small little creatures, right? And because God gave him that victory, no doubt God would give him this victory. His identity of who he was in relation to Yahweh God was based on experience. And because he had those experience of God giving him the victory, he knew that God would also give him the victory over Goliath, which he did. His identity was rooted in God, not in armor, in rank, or his military experience. In fact, I mentioned to you before, but in verse 39 of our text, he rejected Saul's armor because he trusted God's name more than human strength. It doesn't make any sense, folks. It doesn't make any logical, tactical, strategic sense for David to go out there without wearing armor. But he trusted in the power of God more than he trusted in the power of mankind. It's an important lesson for all of us in leadership roles or just in our everyday life, our identity has to be rooted in our relationship with God. Now, this is a almost cliche line. I know some of you have heard this before, so pardon the cliche. Courage grows when we know whose we are, not just who we are. When we know that God is in our corner, that He is supporting the actions that we are doing in the world, in His name, we can trust in God's power, not our own strength. In Romans chapter 8, verse 31, it simply says, if God is for us, who can be against us? Now, that does not guarantee we're not going to have difficulty and trials in life, but it does give us the courage to be able to say, no matter what trials are in front of us, God is still with us. So David had that courage, and it began with the God-centered identity. We also see that courage, when it's displayed, declares the power of God, not our own power. David does not say his experience with the lion and the bear to Goliath. Goliath don't care, or Goliath does not care, right? Goliath is like, I've been fighting in a war since I was your age, and I've got this no problem. David doesn't say, well, I've been a shepherd boy for a little while, and there's a lion and a bear one time. No, he says, you've defied the God of the Israelite army. You don't know what you're talking about. God is going to give me this victory. I'm going to cut off your head and give all your friends' bodies for the birds and the wild beasts to eat. That's how confident he was in this combat. He lifts up God's name as the source of his power before he lifts up that stone. In fact, he believed that God's power would be revealed through the conflict. We also look at the way that he phrased his opening argument against Goliath before the actual battle started. And he says one thing specifically that I want to highlight. He talked about the idea of his courage to face down Goliath. It was almost evangelistic. It was almost like he was declaring the power of God through this combat that day. He says that all the earth may know the army of Yahweh God, or the power of the Lord. When it comes to us in our modern day situations, I doubt we're going to be facing 8-foot-tall guys in back alleys that's trying to mug us. But the courage that we need in our daily life, the trials that we face, the courage that we display should point others to the glory and the sovereignty of God our Creator. When we go through difficult times, people around us should be inspired and encouraged because they know we're not facing those difficulties through our own human strength, but through the strength of God Almighty. In Psalm 20 and verse 7, the psalmist says, "Some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." So David had that courage that we should all aspire to have, and that courage declared the power of God. We also see that David had that courage, and that courage takes bold action. Again, I told you, honestly, if I was to fight an 8-foot-tall dude in combat, I wouldn't bring a sling, I wouldn't bring no armor, I wouldn't run towards the battle line, I'd run away from the battle line. David ran towards the giant. He didn't hesitate or wait, he ran towards the battle. And in fact, he used what he had and trusted God to do the rest. There's a whole other conversation we could have about the gifts that God has bestowed upon each one of us, the abilities He's given us, the training He has given us, the experience He has given us through life. But by using what we already have, and trusting God to do the rest is a huge act of faith. David had that kind of faith. Victory came not because of the weapon, because of the faith behind it. Same thing is true in our lives. We don't have what we think we need, but we've been given gifts by God to be used in this world with courage and faith to follow through. The lesson we can pull from this is that true courage moves. True courage is not stagnant. Faith is not just a belief. It acts boldly even when we are afraid. In James chapter 2 and verse 17, James writes, "Faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." If you have faith or belief, great. What are you doing to show that you have faith or belief? If the answer is nothing, we're not truly acting, are we? Kind of tricking ourselves, fooling ourselves, deceiving ourselves. James was trying to hit that point there in chapter 2, verse 17. David's courage is a huge lesson for all of us in our daily lives. Because there are things that we are facing which are scary, which we don't have all the answers for. And we don't know how we're going to make it through it. But if we have the courage, just like David had in this situation, facing our difficulties, we know that God is behind us. David's courage was not grounded in skill or size, but in the presence, the power, and the promise of God. 3 points, even alliterated, there you go. Every good gospel sermon has 3 points, and they've got to have the same starting letter, right? So says the apostle. No. Easy way to remember. Presence, power, promise of God. Here's a question for you folks. As we wrap up our lessons this month, talking about our heroes from the Old Testament, and what they teach us about how to live in this world in a faithful way with God. What giants are you facing today? There could be a giant in your way, in your life this morning. I can't see anyone's got an 8-foot guy in front of them, but maybe it feels like an 800-foot tall guy in your life right now. And you are looking at that challenge, and you don't know how you're going to be victorious. Courage can help you face that giant. Here's a thought for you, just a question. We're told to be careful what we pray for, just in a practical way. If you pray for patience, does God give you patience? Or does He give you a situation where you can practice having patience? Be careful what you pray for. When you pray for courage, does God give you courage? Or does He give you difficulties in your life where you can practice having the courage within you, pointing up to get through that difficult situation? What giants do you have in your life this morning? Face those difficulties in the name of the Lord. One of the main verses from our text, 1 Samuel 17, verse 47, the battle was not David versus Goliath, the battle was the Lord's. This morning, if you're facing a battle, we'd love to pray for you, to lift you up, and to encourage you. You can see one of our elders at the door, or you can come forward and talk to me and Blaine. We can pray for you right now. If you have a need to respond, please do so now while we stand and we sing.